Sony and Kadokawa is official, but not what we expected. Sony will buy a 10% stake in Kadokawa, the owner of Elden Ring maker From Software, but won't raise its stake any higher than that. We all know that's a bunch of bullshit. That's a bunch of PR corporate speak. The two firms will collaborate on expanding Kadokawa's IP. So, this news is breaking, it is spreading on the internet, and it is a follow-up continuation of what I and so many others have been talking about for weeks at this point. Technically for me, years, because of ever since they bought Funimation and Crunchyroll. But the main point is that at long last we have somewhat of a conclusion to the Sony Kadokawa drama that has been taking place. Sony and Kadokawa have come to an agreement, and Sony has made a deal with Kadokawa to buy 10% of their shares. Now, what does this necessarily mean? Well, shareholders, shares, stocks, and stuff in the company, if you own enough, you own a certain percentage of the company. That means that Sony, at this current time, owns 10% of Kadokawa. Now, when you factor everything in, 10% is not 100%, it's not 70%, it's not 50%, but 10% is better than, let's say, 2% or 3%. And effectively, this has positioned Sony as the largest shareholder for Kadokawa. That means that Sony has more of a foothold and pull than any other shareholder within Kadokawa. For instance, when they go to their shareholder meetings and they talk and all that and what they need to do for the company's future, Sony is the one that is mainly going to be leading the charge because they have the biggest amount of money invested within Kadokawa. So, in the grand scheme of things, Sony has effectively gained a large control of Kadokawa, but they don't own them. So this gets into some of the good news that people has been spreading around today throughout the community. That Sony did not buy out Kadokawa completely, which would have effectively given them a monopoly. Arguably, Sony already has a monopoly on the anime and manga market, especially in the West. There is no arguing that. But at least when it comes to anime, manga, and light novel stuff within Japan, they don't yet. But if they would have gotten Kadokawa, 100% they would have. So the fact that it's only 10%, it has definitely stopped that dark outcome, that potential dark future where it is under one corporation completely and that there would be no competitors, no competition for them. So the good news about all this is that Sony doesn't own Kadokawa. The bad news is this is the beginning. And so let's get into that one. So, before people are quick to say that, Sony doesn't own Kadokawa, they don't own From Soft, and, Kadokawa gets to remain independent, we gotta look at what this all meant, or where this all started. As I've talked about in videos already, Kadokawa, the reason why they went to Sony, and why Sony even did this as well, is because Kadokawa was in fear of a foreign takeover, hostile takeover from a foreign country / company, like Tencent or Kakao. They did not want, companies and countries buying them out that wasn't actually originating from Japan. That was why Kadokawa was so worried. Also, as we know, there was a lot of disgruntled employees that was very unhappy with the management of Kadokawa, with the CEO, which I talked about in a video about a week ago. But the point of the matter is that, the reason why they did it was because they were worried about, basically losing control of themselves. So they were willing to offer a deal up to Sony for they could somewhat remain independent, which, in the grand scheme of things, they still have somewhat independence, at least for now. Now, I am not someone that's a lawyer or a stockbroker or anything like that, but I do know some things. When it comes to this type of stuff, when it comes to deals and all that, they usually come with some form of legal contracts, and, you have to invest a certain amount of money, or you can only invest a certain amount of money in a certain given amount of time, which means that with this overall deal that Sony and Kadokawa made, Sony might not be able to buy any more stocks of Kadokawa for a while. For instance, maybe a few years, maybe 5 years, maybe 10 years. Who really knows? Maybe it's a full-blown they can't buy anymore. I doubt that, but you get the point. What this means is once a certain time frame, dissipates and passes, Sony might be able to once again sit down at the table, talk with Kadokawa, and buy maybe another 5 or 10% of the company, for instance, become even larger version of a shareholder for the company of Kadokawa, and own more of them. And eventually they will continue to dip and buy a little bit more of the company until they full-blown just own Kadokawa outright, which might take about 5-10 years, might take 2 decades, but it is a potential outcome. Like, it can happen depending on whatever contracts and deals that Sony made with Kadokawa at the table, which obviously we're never going to see. So that gets into the main point. Obviously, we're not going to have a full-blown landscape change now overnight, because it was averted. The dark timeline, the potential bad end was averted for now, but it has been pushed back maybe a decade. It has been pushed back a long time, and a decade is a long time. Like, nobody knows what's going to happen a week from now. Nobody even knows what's going to happen tomorrow, or even 10 minutes from now. You know, nobody really knows what happens in life. So, for all we know, in 10 years, Sony might not even exist anymore. Is that going to happen? Doubt that, but you get the point. So, anything can happen from now and a decade from now, probably whenever Sony's able to probably revisit this situation again, but it is still something that is potentially not good in the future. But it makes sense why Kadokawa wanted to do this, because they knew there was a threat of other companies buying them out. That's why they wanted a shield, aka Sony, in front to be able to protect them from a very bad situation. So now that all this is out, all the cards are on the table, what's going to happen? Well, regardless of things now not going to change very quickly, and Sony has not technically gotten a massive monopoly, we got to look at why this deal also was made from Sony's perspective. Sony gained a lot from this. 10% stake in Kadokawa is huge, especially when they've been building up quite a portfolio with anime, manga, and merchandise content, and the From Software stuff is just a cherry on top. So when you factor all of this in, they gained a lot from this. They now have more pull within the shareholder meetings with Kadokawa to get what they want, to license certain things, to make things get off the ground, and actually become an official series, to eventually become an anime. They definitely have a lot more pull on that now. They might not have 100% control of it, but they definitely have a larger voice that will have a lot more weight when they're in the discussion room. And Kadokawa, after this whole situation, will probably be more inclined to work with Sony for anything they need, instead of other people that might be shareholders with them, because Sony is the largest shareholder right now for Kadokawa. So this will probably, in turn, cause the situation where I was already worried about when it came to Western stuff and anime. For instance, we know Sony owns Crunchyroll, Funimation, Right Stuff, and a bunch of other little niche things like Aniplex as well. They are able to effectively funnel everything from Japan and license it into Crunchyroll. And any competition, let's say for instance High Dive, will not be able to as easily get series if it is under the umbrella of Kadokawa, so to speak. So because of that, Sony can still effectively kill off competition, maybe not in Japan, but at the very least within the West still. They still have somewhat more control than they did a week ago, which is not good. This does mean that things will continue to progress as it has been, especially within the West. The Japan stuff has been averted for now, but any issues that we've currently been experiencing within the Western sphere of anime, manga, and light novels and stuff will probably gradually continue to go down a very dark and sad direction. Now, maybe Sony is waking up and they realize that there is a lot of flack and backlash. That is a potential possibility what led to this 10% stake buyout. We got to talk about that one for a second. I think that it's very clear that this whole situation with Sony, you know, has gotten very public. A lot of people have talked about it. One of the big focusing matters that people have had is the From Software acquisition, like if they get Kadokawa, and a lot of people have boiled this entire situation down just to that instead of talking about the grand scheme of things of just entertainment itself. But the point is it's gotten a lot of coverage, and there's definitely people on this platform, on YouTube, that has covered this content probably way more in depth than I have in the nitty-gritty and knows every little intricate detail of what they're talking about. What I'm trying to say is that Sony probably did see the backlash, what people were talking about and saying about the situation, and so to avoid that and to temper people and make people not as upset with them, they probably, in turn, maybe also only wanted to get 10% right now because of a potential monopoly issue. Maybe, you know, governments might have cracked down on them or stopped it or whatever. So they wanted to avoid that possibility and just slowly consume potentially Kadokawa as the years go by, where nobody really notices. Because it's like, think about this. 5 years from now, it's stated Kadokawa buys 3%. Another 3%, or not Kadokawa, Sony buys another 3% of Kadokawa. Obviously, people are going to be like, oh, it's just 3%. They're not going to think about it. But then you add 3% onto their already 10%, that's 13%. Another year passes. They buy another 3%. Okay, that 13% is now 16%. You get the point. So Sony can buy it slowly, and people will not really think about it because most people won't think about the percentages because it's just so little. They won't look at the grand scheme of what Sony is actively trying to do. Now, obviously, Sony hasn't done this yet, but it is a common tactic companies do. It is very common that they will do stuff like this, and so I feel like it's more of a PR situation why it happened like this, but also for them to do it gradually to where they're not cracked down upon by governments wanting to split them up because of a monopoly. That's my assumption on the entire situation. But yeah, I wanted to bring this news to everyone. The deal has been made. For now, the Dark Timeline has been pushed back a little bit, but it is still in the distance. Maybe a lot further now where you can barely see it, but it's still there. And I'm definitely not going to stop talking about this situation as years go on by. I will definitely bring this up if something happens, because it's very important and a lot more people need to be aware of this situation. Because this doesn't just have an effect on, let's say, the gaming industry. This has an effect on entertainment and just Japanese culture itself. It could fundamentally change the very foundations of it if Sony does manage to continue whittling and spreading their tendrils in the industry and they use Kadokawa as a vessel. It's still possible. So I'm never going to stop talking about this. If any information comes out in the years to come, I will definitely make a video on it. But for now, that is all we got. The deal has been made. 10% has been bought. The dark path and timeline has been averted a little bit, but it is still there. So do not forget about that. But be safe. Stay healthy, everybody. I love ya. Chibi out.